How do we do apologetics in the urban setting? What are some of the toughest apologetics questions facing the Black community today? We've got with us a guest who is eminently trained and equipped and has a heart for addressing these issues. Dr. Eric Mason has put together a recent book. I read all of it today. It's been a bestseller in a number of categories. It's called Urban Apologetics. So first thing I want to say is, Dr. Eric, thanks for coming on the show.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you for having me. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you for having me.
Well, this is a treat and an honor. And let me jump in and start by saying you start the book, one of your chapters, by talking about your story becoming a believer in the 90s at Bowie
Mhm.
State University. I want to make sure I got
Yeah,
that right. Bowie State University, a historically Black college. Tell me your story. I'm dying to hear what drove you to the faith at that point in your life in the 90s.
yeah. Well, I grew up in the church, so I grew up as a church boy, but I wasn't a believer. The church that I grew up in was a block from my house, and so I pretty much it was a haven for me, to be in the church at that time. And so for me, I grew up. I was familiar through everything from the being sort of catechized, if you will, in the church. And but when I went to college, I lost my mind and kind
Hmm.
of went away from the faith. Was listening to Farrakhan, Malcolm X, and uh, hip hop that I would say is very anti-Christian. At that time, it was very unpopular for a Black person to be a Christian. A Different World was one of the top TV shows, and historically Black colleges experienced a massive surge in the 80s and the 90s. And
Huh.
when I went to college, I didn't have Jesus on my mind. My mom sent me with a New American Standard, NASB,
Hmm.
Open Bible, old Bible out of print. You could probably find it on eBay or Amazon. Very, very good Bible. And I ended up finding myself, uh, I was trying to talk to this girl, and we ended up going to service one morning on campus. So I guess a bunch of different groups of churches started doing a basically a Sunday morning service, and I ended up
Huh.
going to it this one day. And long story short, I heard the gospel clearly for the first time,
Wow.
and everything made sense. And I trusted Christ.
Hmm.
Needed discipleship. Didn't have anybody discipling me, so I was kind of oops, sorry about that.
It's okay.
Fledging. I kicked it. I was kind of fledging a little bit. Thank you, son. I was kind of fledging a bit and ended up getting discipled. And I was a modalist at first, and then ended up my wife to be and a guy that was discipling me on the campus, uh, who was hyper charismatic, but
Hmm.
knew his fundamental doctrine like no other. And he walked with me, and I began walking with the Lord. I denounced my fraternity, and
Wow.
I immediately started preaching on the campus. And so
Wow.
I didn't know that's what I was doing. I just was overwhelmed by the might of Christ,
Huh.
the supremacy of Jesus, the gospel. Was reading my Bible at least 4 hours a day, memorizing verses by reading, have a photographic memory. So everything was sticking like a gorilla glue, man.
Hmm.
And I began engaging people from the Nation of Islam. One of the guys I pledged with, he was in the Nation of Islam. He's what's called a Fruit of Islam, which is their security. And went to the mosque with him before, and I saw this stuff was crazy. So I was going through Matthew, started defending the gospel through the book of Matthew. I didn't know what I was doing with urban apologetics at the time. I
Hmm.
just knew that, you know, I was dealing with, you had leaders of the new school, Tribe Called Quest, these are hip hop groups. You had Poor Righteous Teachers, Wu Tang Clan, Public Enemy that were railing against white supremacy, Western Christianity, and the white Jesus. Throughout their work, even Ice Cube did some stuff on it,
Hmm.
and from there, I was just radically changed by the gospel. Yeah,
That's amazing. Now, you've written this book, Urban Apologetics, that I hope my viewers will pick up. I read,
yeah.
there it is. I have a digital copy, not a physical one. It is very well written, opened my eyes to a lot of issues like the Hebrew Israelite movement that I'm not that familiar with. and
Yeah.
how to contextualize in the urban context. But it sounds
Hmm.
like it really was understanding the gospel that led you to the faith. And then very quickly, once you were a believer, you had to defend it. And that's where apologetics came in. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, good stuff. How different are the questions now that people are facing in the urban context versus in the 90s when you came to faith? Are they essentially the same or have they changed pretty
Yeah,
radically?
they're essentially the same. It's just that, when we talk about, and I know we're going to get to this, so the questions are pretty much is the identity question. Uh, Carl Ellis, in his dissertation on thug spirituality, a tour de force, I hope, gets published one day, and he does a presentation on it. But he talks about significance, dignity, and identity. Significance. What is my purpose? Identity, who am I? And dignity, what's my value? And those are the burning questions that African Americans are asking because of the way in which we were socialized and in the Americas for the last 400 plus years. And that has been a burning question that was answered particularly by the AME Church and somewhat the Church of God in Christ up until the early 1900s. And then once the black middle class began to arise, more poor churches in rural areas and inner cities. Then you have the Great Migration, and then you have more of the what we call the uppity churches. And what ended up happening is everything from the Moorish Science Temple, which was started in Chicago, that was it's still a cult movement, a mystic movement, Egyptian mystery movement, or Kemetic mystery movement that basically, and Eastern philosophy, it kind of is a hodgepodge, kind of a Frankenstein, theologically and sociologically and ideologically. And a man by the name of Farad Muhammad ended up learning from Noble Drew Ali. Then Elijah Poole, who became Elijah Muhammad, ended up learning the Moorish Science Temple teachings, morphed them into the Nation of Islam. So they took it's like another Frankenstein. So they took some Islam
Okay.
and then created a mystical Islam, and then went from there and used Christian language because a lot of blacks, because by and large, many of us, even if we weren't Christians, we were either raised in the church or raised in an environment where the church was the pillar of the community. So they knew they had to use some level of Christianese in
Yeah.
their linguistics to be able to. It was brilliant for them, but it's deceptive from our perspective. And then they use more simple more science temple teachings and teachings from the United Negro Improvement Association, started by Marcus Garvey, who was actually a Christian, or Catholic, and Catholic Christian, whatever you want to say,
Sure.
and and then hijacked Black history and then recreated this whole mythological narrative that is. But what the Nation of Islam did was they became, with the Black Panther Party, the central voices, and Malcolm X, central
Mm-hmm.
voices for Black thought. And so, even though people didn't join the Nation of Islam or more Science Temple, it was enough for them to view Christianity as contextually, ideologically, and spiritually incompatible with Blackness. And so, the
Mm.
whole idea of white Jesus, Bible being changed, alternative history, Christianity being ripped from uh, um, um, Egyptian mystery or Kemetic mysteries system or teachings became like urban lore. So you'll see every 20 to 30 years, when there's a racial crisis in the country, it always bubbles. So in the past, it
Interesting.
would, so you would see, like, it happened in the 20s during the Harlem Renaissance. That's when you see the first inklings of Hebrew movements, Hebrew
Mm-hmm.
identity movement happening. And then it kind of went to the 30s when the Nation of Islam started, but then it kind of went silent until like the late 50s. Malcolm X comes on the scene, takes Nation of Islam global, and then through the 60s, then you had some Black Power stuff during the 70s. Then it went silent for a while. Then the late 80s, Farrakhan's voice got big.
Yeah.
The Rodney King thing just blew everything up, and it was like, man, see. And then later, now you see it making its rise again. And what makes it different now is two things. it's two. I mean, really two things that makes it different now. But really one major thing, the internet. So
Mm,
now the internet has given people more informational staying power through memes, through YouTube channels, through books have always been there. A lot of revisionist history, and so now this stuff has made its way into the corpus of Black culture. And so now like you can find a regular Black person that's theological. I mean, nobody's really theological. Everybody has a
sure.
theology, but um, talking to the apologist, right? Um, and on a worldview, even though they all borrow from a Judeo-Christian worldview to critique a Christian worldview, and so the internet has made two things go global. It's made the Christian identity, the Black identity issue go global because there are descendants of abused Blacks around the globe, Europe, Africa,
Mm,
Asia, you know what I'm saying? And
yep.
America, and of course also South America. So that resonated with a lot of people. And so now when people hear the word urban, they think inner city or Black, poor,
Yeah.
Hispanic. But urban really is a culture now. It's not just a location, because
Mm,
now hip hop has been the missionary for pop culture for the last 30 years. And so rock and roll was the missionary for years. Then pop culture had its own pop culture deal with Michael Jackson. But now the mouthpiece for popular culture is hip hop, or somebody call it mumble rap or whatever you want to say. But now that's a huge, huge deal now, and so now it's here to stay. Yeah.
now, you described it in your book. You said Christian hip hop of the 90s and 2000s
No,
was.
hip hop, just regular hip hop, just regular hip hop.
Oh, but in the book you said the Christian hip hop of this was a form of apologetics, if I read it correctly.
Yeah, so there were some groups that tried to, there's a group called Nation of Gods and Earths, which is a offshoot from the Nation of Islam. Nation of Islam is offshoot kind of from Orthodox Islam. Clarence 13X in the 60s started a movement of what's called the Poor Righteous Teachers. And Allah, they believe the word Allah points to man being God, arm,
Mm,
leg, arm, head. And so Black man is God. And so then that began to the whole idea of the poor righteous teacher movement. I mean, if you look at KRS-One, Jay-Z, the Wu-Tang Clan, Busta Rhymes, leaders of the New School, Tribe Called Quest, all of those guys are really they are 5%ers. They believe the Black man is God. When Jay-Z was on the Breakfast Club, he had the number 7 with the star, which they believe is the number of God. So yeah, it's interesting, man.
that is interesting. So help me understand the draw to like the Nation of Islam, because when you described in the 80s, I was a teenager.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
remember the Million Man March. I remember hearing some of the things that are very anti-Semitic that he said, yet it's been huge within the Black community and beyond. What's the draw to something like the Nation of Islam?
Yeah, so the draw to the Nation of Islam tried to say they had 250,000 people. I would say that's way blown out of proportion.
Hmm.
Uh, but they were able in Chicago and in New York and in Philadelphia, in particular, somewhat in California, but really the hubs were Chicago, Harlem, Washington D.C. a little bit, in Philadelphia were the Nation of Islam, and North Jersey. I say North Jersey and somewhat South Jersey, and they had a because of Malcolm X and the resurgence of people wearing, Malcolm X. I don't know if you remember in the early '90s, it was a lot of Black culture clothing lines, and they had the X on it for Malcolm
Yeah.
X, and Malcolm X's teachings about Black identity, even though people didn't get into all of the crazy jargon of the Nation of Islam that's just made up history, the tribe of Shabazz and Yaqub creating white people, that's the real devil. Read the book, you'll know what I'm talking about. And
Hmm.
so it was more of a socioeconomic influence for Black identity than it was anything, and this had a lasting effect now. And even today, people like Snoop Dogg and others. That's why Farrakhan has been really a mainstay influencer in hip hop culture because of that impact. So they're addressing a
Hmm.
Black identity, and sub-spiritual prophetic voices that has spoken, I would say, on socioeconomic issues correctly. Their root is wrong. They don't have any eschatological hope. They don't have any soteriological uh, uh, rooting or empowerment, and they have a different Jesus than us. So yeah.
You've talked a lot about Black identity. The first chapter in the book, it's a compilation for those who are watching. We're here with Dr. Eric
Yeah.
Mason, put together this book called Urban Apologetics, and it's been a bestseller in 5, 6 different categories, which I'm thrilled to hear. But you wrote at least 3 or 4 plus chapters in it. One of the first chapters
Yeah.
is titled Restoring Black Identity. Tell
Yeah.
me why that's the first chapter that you wrote.
Because the thing that all of these groups, whether you're talking about Kemetic and Yoruba spirituality, if you're talking about Nation of Islam, 5% Nation of Islam, Black atheism, all of these different groups, all of and the Hebrew Israelites, the one thing they have in common is they're trying to give definition to the existence of Black people, because of whether it's the curse of Ham that Christianity really took from the ancient Moors, and Orthodox Islam, which both of those they were the most severe slave owners prior to Christianity ever owning slaves over 1,000 years ago. And so when a lot of slave theology that came with the curse of Ham, and even the Puritans teaching uh, against Black identity on slave ships. They were the chaplains on slave ships. It's a very good dissertation written on that has receipts and documents. I'm not in my library right now, or else I'll pull it out. But basically, the history of that has just weaved itself into Western Christendom, and it's been that's the main. That's what they're fighting against. They're fighting against the marriage of Christianity with Constantinianism, and that still, like, even alt-right Christianity, and even what I would call political Christianity or Christian nationalism, has its rooting in Constantinianism that has made its way through the centuries through Europe and was transported over here during slave trade.
So I think I understand what you mean by Christian nationalism, but tell me what you mean by Constantinianism. Is this the blending of the church and the state that's expressed today with Christian nationalism?
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's where it began. Even if you read the Puritans, any Puritans, they've viewed, even in covenant theology, there's a view that the church is the new Israel. And so sometimes there's the replacement theology and the literalism of the church being Israel almost made whites the chosen people. And so that's the whole idea of the curse of Ham. We're chosen, you're not. And so they kind of borrowed from Judaism and transported that, of course, using Romans chapter 9 through 11 and even Galatians for their replacement theology. But it really ended up becoming, because of, and what I know we'll get to it, the whitewashing of Christianity. It almost felt like whites are the chosen people, blacks aren't. So yeah.
You have a line in your book that it's the one I underlined. I stopped and I read it a few times because I try to put myself in your position and understand what this would be like. You said, as a Christian who is Black, I sometimes am led to feel as if I'm following the religion of my oppressors. Now, you obviously don't think Christianity. You think Christianity is the one who liberates, but that's an experience you relate to. So how do you live in that tension?
Well, it's key, because white Christians usually, like, even listening to you and hearing, man, I didn't know this stuff existed. That's that's what I want white Christians to feel like, man. So, like, people that are calling us CRT, Marxists, ethnic Gnosticism, and utilizing those kind of batting terms to not deal with the Black experience in America, don't realize that to be a Christian, like when I was talking about being in college, to be a Christian was almost it was viewed by Blacks as hating Black people, because they viewed it as the white man's religion. And so because of that, we've had to defend on multiple ends. We've had to defend in the church, in Black church culture. We've had to defend the faith in general Black culture. And we've had to defend the faith in general evangelical Western Christian culture. And so we had to do three-way apologetics that people don't really understand to this day.
That's a helpful way to look at it. Now you have another phrase in your book that also jumped out to me. You said, quote, the decentralization of black life from the black church has created one of the strongest cultural shifts that African Americans have seen in the last 50 years.
Yes, yes, yes,
Talk about that,
yes.
if you will.
Yeah, so one of the things that happened is after the civil rights movement, but when blacks suffered, and this goes for any Christian movement, right? Really, the civil rights movement was a Christian movement that got co-opted by general culture, because it was all. I mean, if you look at slavery abolitionist movements, and you look at Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, and you look at Ida B. Wells, you look at Frederick Douglass, all of those people were Christians, were clearly Christians, and so what ended up happening is over time, when we had a what I call a legislative freedom that led to systemic racism, because racism had to be hidden, but it's in plain sight with redlining and so many other things. The church began to be decentralized because I talk about in the presentation about how I break up black generations. You have the civil rights generation. You have they had
Mm-hmm.
children, and they had the black bourgeoisie and the black power generation, as well as the hippie generation. And those people ended up getting the experience, particularly black people, some of the experience of general culture. And there were other provisions because of groups that created other sociological help mechanisms that were rooted in the black church. Now the black church wasn't needed, and it became very decentralized. And back in the day, you had to go to church, and so a lot of
Yeah.
people, a lot of people after that, during that, you might want to call them the busters. The buster generation ended up saying, I'm not going to make my children go to church. But what that did is that was, it became a judge's situation. What people began to do was right in their own eyes because they knew not the Lord, or at least, the culture of communicating the truth of the gospel and and Christianity was no longer. So you grew up with praying grandmothers. Now you don't have praying grandmothers anymore as much, and so
Hmm.
grandmothers praying for souls and that type of thing. And so now the black church, because we got integrated into schools. Like if you look after civil rights movement, there weren't many black institutions developed that specifically from the church, because most historically black colleges were started by black churches. If you look at Francis Grimke, I have his works over here, edited by Carter G. Woodson, and he was the chancellor of Howard University. And so when you look at the whole Tuskegee starting, and you see who funded these schools, Bowie State University, the school I went to, there's not a school that Morehouse Spelman. There's pretty much not a black Bennett. You just go on and on and on. Hampton. You look at their history, and there's some connection to the church. Now that all institutions were opened up for integration, it integrated blacks into culture, but then there was still the emphatic sealing effect that was in it. But then there were other mechanisms that were options. So when that happened, the church became seen as not as needed, and that's kind of been a major shift in our culture.
One of the phrases that comes up a lot in your book is psychological trauma that you
Mm-hmm.
describe, another author describes, that many black people experience
Mm-hmm.
in our culture today. So when doing apologetics, apologetics is giving an answer to challenges, but you and I both know that some of the biggest barriers are moral, they're emotional, they're psychological. How do you
Absolutely.
do how do you do an apologetics to in the urban setting that deals with the intellectual issues but resonates also with the deeper psychological trauma that is there for so many black people?
Yeah, I think when you look at slavery, you have to understand that when slave owners got reparations, like one guy in Texas got 80 acres because he lost slaves. And so, slave owners got reparations because they lost slaves. If you look at Wells Fargo, they used to have mortgages on slaves. A lot of people don't know that. And
Wow.
so, it's crazy. And so when you look at being let out of slavery, our people were raped, pillaged, families broken up, even though the black family, like Sun Chan Ra says, the fact that the black family still exists is a miracle. And so when you look, they got let. Just imagine somebody getting raped, and like one of our family members or someone getting raped, and we just make them go to school the next day, you know,
Hmm.
and make them act like there's no trauma that ever happened to you. When
Hmm.
slaves got out of slavery, though, even the ones that got reparations, the vigilante white groups that were in their area took their reparations. So they took their land, they destroyed their businesses, like in Black Wall Street, like in Atlanta, like in Greenwood section of Oklahoma, like in Philly and Washington D.C., Chicago. If you do a study on when blacks were actually uh, building their economic base in black areas, like Chinese do so greatly, they whites always did, like it happened in Springfield, Missouri, where blacks were doing well. It was about 1,200 blacks doing well in Springfield, Missouri. They ended up lying and saying it happened at the Delaware Massacre, the Raleigh Massacre. All of those massacres were whites who got jealous of that black economic development, and ended up someone saying someone raped a white woman. And so it ended up they got lynched. And what's funny is I looked at the story of the massacre of, I want to say 1919 in Springfield, and they basically, man, lynched the black people on Saturday, and then on Easter Sunday, they went in their Easter garb, the white folks of the town, and took pictures and pieces of the garbs of the lynched black people as
My gosh.
as pieces of memorabilia from that lynching. And 1,200 African Americans were literally gutted from that area of Springfield. That's the kind of history that a lot of us don't know. When we tell history, we want to tell a part of history. So the way
Hmm.
that blacks have been constantly traumatized, here in, I just changed camera.
Hey, oh,
Um,
you changed. Oh, there we go. You're back. Okay.
yeah, I changed cameras.
Sorry.
And so
You're good.
I can do it like this. And so the way blacks have
It's
been
fine.
traumatized um in in uh in our culture has just been crazy over and over and over again. So when we see, Trayvon Martin, or we see we see, Eric Garner, you see all of these different things, public lynchings, we call them. They are reminders of our messed up past. So yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So,
Let's see if it works
so
now.
help
But
me
keep
understand.
going.
You said there's a lot of the past that people don't know and are not aware of that
Yeah.
you're pointing
Yeah.
to, and
Yeah.
yet when these present things happen, it's a reminder of the past.
Yes.
So, is it that there's particulars that are lost on people, but the big idea of how blacks are treated is a regular part of the trauma that black people still experience today? Is that fair?
Yeah, because when you look at, it's a book called Slave Patrols. It's a blue book written, and it basically tells you the history of the slave patrols and its connection to the police. So the slave patrols were those who patrolled the plantations with shotguns on horses that made sure they wouldn't want to track down slaves when they ran away, and they were kind of like the taskmasters, like in Egypt. And so what ended up happening was, particularly in Virginia, Northern Virginia, a lot of the slave patrols ended up becoming the police department. And so the relationship between African Americans and the police department is a very, very traumatic one.
Hmm.
And so a lot of people don't know that walking the beat was the same idea of the slave patrol. So when you see two officers walking the beat, it's a reflection of the slave patrols walking the beat, policing black people on the plantation.
So when it comes to the apologetic task, does that mean it's a matter of being aware of and sensitive to and attentive to some of the psychological hurt and countering some of the lies that were perpetrated in the name of Christianity? It
Yeah.
sounds like both of those are just as real and important in doing apologetics in the urban context. Is that fair?
Yeah, because a lot of those people will be professing Christians. Those slave patrols will be professing Christians. They were deacons in churches. You know, I have a historian who is at my church. She teaches at the University of Delaware. Matter of fact, she's one of the contributors in the book. And I asked her, I said, can you find anything in history, anything, because you know, being in scholarship, you know, it may not have been put in a book, but you have to, it's all kinds of journals out there that are only known by scholars. And I said, can you find anything that says that any white Christians significantly came up against white supremacy and came up against spoke against the Ku Klux Klan for the pulpit? And they found, she said, I asked a friend who that's his specialty, and there was only one preacher that they have on record that really railed against it publicly. And so that type of thing has just been a tough deal for Black people.
That makes sense. That's really helpful to bring that in. It intrigues me that you called your book Urban Apologetics, because I've written a couple books with the title, like a book, Apologetics for New Generation, but it went through my mind, do I even want to use the word apologetics in the title? Because a lot of people don't know what it is. A lot of people think it's just this rational debating, don't understand it. So when you talk about the Black community, how is apologetics understood? When they see that title, Urban Apologetics, is it like, what is that? Is it, this is awesome, we need this? Like, what's the response and understanding even of what apologetics is?
Yeah, so Blacks aren't a monolith, but they're, you know, now it's become huge because of some of the work we've been doing. So there have been tens of thousands of African Americans that have been impacted by it. And we've had some debates and some engagement that a lot of people are doing on YouTube. We sponsored a debate at our church with Chris Bashard. He's a dear friend of mine that does a lot of work, and he's been doing it for 30 years. Matter of fact, he endorsed the book. Dear friend of mine. And he basically apologetics is now being seen. I mean, we just call it, you know, you just reflect based on 1 Peter 3:15, Jude 3, you know, the usual passages. But what we view urban apologetics as is a subsidiary of general apologetics that is contextualized specifically towards the unique issues that African Americans deal with. And so, or Black people deal with, because I got it's interesting. So I did a post on something today, and a guy from I think it's Mozambique. Yep. He says, I hope I can get your book shipped to Mozambique. You'd be surprised at the supposed men of God, little g, that have been embracing the Black Hebrew Israelites and declaring Jesus isn't Lord. Thank you for your ministry. And so it's global now, man. It's literally global. And so people talk about the prosperity gospel's impact on Africa, but people have no idea what Black identity cults are doing now in Africa. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about this for a second, because this is not an area I've studied a lot, heard about it, and I was intrigued. Reading the chapter was super helpful in terms of the theology, in terms of the history behind it, in terms of their tactical approach. What is the Hebrew Israelite movement? And then after you explain kind of what it is, let's talk about some of the key areas where you think it falls short biblically.
Yeah, so the Hebrew Israelite movement is a movement really that goes back to the post-emancipation. My mind just went blank. But it the guy, he was at he's a big part of the Azusa Street revival, and he ended up denouncing a lot of the crazy kind of new thought theology that made its way into the Azusa Street revival. But he was the one. He's one of the ones proclaiming that Blacks were the original Hebrews. So they're real, and that ended up turning over into the commandment keepers and those who went to actual. There was a lot of conversions to rabbinic Judaism in the 20s, and some of the ones who were in that later on, as the years went on, got influenced and ended up starting the Hebrew Israelite movements that we see today that are among the camps. And there are those who will call themselves Messianic Hebrew Israelites or moderates, but there are a lot of, I mean, man, I can't even begin. It's a whole, it needs, like, that's a whole nother book. But
Sure.
The Hebrew Israelites, I don't really have a problem with someone saying they're Hebrew. I really could care less about that. Anybody can say they trace their nationality someplace, right? The question for me though is more, who is Jesus? What do you believe about the Bible? What's your soteriology? How you believe you get to God? You know, and what's your cosmology? You know, what's your eschatology? What are those things? What is your how does sanctification work? Those things for me are the core biblical issues. And your does your ethnicity influence your theology, or does your theology influence your ethnicity? But they try to merge theology and ethnicity through Black ethnocentrism.
Why is that in particular so attractive to many Black people?
Because they say you're in this Bible. They tell you you're in this Bible. The Bible is
Okay.
about you. Now, as a Christian, even if let's just say me and you are Jews, right? We're Hebrews. We would never say the Bible is about us.
Hmm.
I mean, we would never say that if we were ethnic Jews who were Christians or believed in the Bible. We would never. Even a Jew wouldn't say the Bible is about me. And so they made the big story of the Bible about them, and that's the problem. You know, they have in the Psalms it talks about you have taught your statutes to Israel, and they use that as a way. Jesus did not come; he came for the lost sheep of the tribe of Israel. Lost sheep of the tribes of Israel. So they utilize those verses as key points to have really a hierarchical system in the way they view their soteriology.
One of the questions I asked you at the beginning is why there's not a chapter distinctly on, say, sexuality in urban apologetics. Clearly, that's a big issue in urban context as it is everywhere. And you said because this is about identity in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the first chapter, you talk about restoring Black dignity and identity.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us one or two things that you think practically could help do that people in the church could do better.
Yeah, one of the things that I think that is very important is that I looked up the Ethiopian eunuch, right? On just look them up just to get pictures. Put Ethiopian eunuch into Google, right? And I pulled up the images. And interestingly enough, they had white Ethiopian eunuchs, and I'm like, why would they do that? And so when you look at the image of white Jesus, you look at Paul was white, even though he was mistaken as an Egyptian in Acts. And J. Daniel Haynes wrote an amazing article in 1995 talking about it's an amazing article. A PhD student from Dallas Seminary shot to me when I was started working on Urban Apologetics. He said, "I know you're working on this stuff. I'm gonna shoot you this." And I read it, and he basically talked about the fact that it's known that there's racism in the way the presentation of culture is done in scholarship, and it's connected to Adolf von Harnack, a German theologian who basically, I mean, when you read his stuff and you get into his stuff, you see that he was intentional about it. He impacted general academia as well as sacred academia. And like when you look at the cover of, you look at the Egyptians, none of them were white, even though they were pan color. They tend to be colored white. And so art and covers of books and so many different things began to be emphasis with that. Even the early church fathers, when you look at Augustine, whatever you believe his ethnicity was, you look at Origen, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Athanasius, you look at those are North African people. But they, like, even in Thomas Oden's book, where he begins talking about the African nature of the church fathers, they're viewed as the Latin fathers. They're not called the African fathers. And Latin is a word that's more connected to Southern Europe than it is Northern Africa. So it's
right.
Those type of nuances in phrases that have affected what I would say is the whitewashing of Christianity.
That doesn't seem super hard to fix if, especially in apologetics, we care about
Yeah,
truth, paying
yeah,
attention to these things. And I would totally admit, growing up, and this is something I've learned, has not been on my radar and as attentive to as I need to be. But hearing you say this, I'm like, I can do that. We can work on this. If it's sending a message to people that Christianity is a white man's religion and it's turning away people of other ethnicities,
yeah.
let's be careful how we present it. That seems a pretty easy thing that we can do. Now, you've used this term a few times, whitewashing, and I think it's the second chapter in the book that you didn't write, but somebody else wrote. What
Yeah.
is it, and why is it so destructive?
Yeah, so let me start it by saying this. People say when we talk about this stuff, why does color matter? Because you made it matter. And so we wouldn't have a problem with whoever's white is being white. But when you do history, you say, hold up, why is Bathsheba white? Why is Zipporah white? Why is Ruth and Naomi, like, why is everybody white? You know, why are the angels white? Why I posted a thing with Muhammad Ali, just talking about the whiteness of Christianity, and and how it's ingrained in us. It's, I believe whitewashing is intentional. I believe some of it is now a part of the culture of, I would say, academia, in a way that it almost is natural. And I don't think it's always intentionally done. It's just a culture that
Sure.
has been fully accepted in the way people portray biblical people in the scriptures. When you look at even the book of Isaiah, J. Daniel Haynes talks about this, that there the Isaiah 25, I can't remember what chapters it is, but there's a section of Isaiah that's written during the 25th dynasty of Egypt. And if you know anything about Egyptian history, the Nubians conquered Egypt. So they were dark black people. Everybody,
Yeah.
if you're from Europe, they were viewed as Ethiopians. Ethiopian meant black, Kush meant black. And so why do we change the linguistics in there when we talk about people groups in there? And so I think that that's intentional. And that has been a way in which black contributions have been cloaked. And there are a lot of people who have written on that.
Good stuff. Super helpful.
Yeah.
There's some questions that are coming in here, which love to have you weigh in on. If you have questions for me, I realize I missed a bunch of these. State them as clearly as you can in the comment section, and I will try to get these to Eric to comment on. One of the chapters in the book that intrigued me was on atheism and the black community. That's not
Yes.
something
Yes.
I had heard as much. Is that
Mhm.
growing? If so, why?
Massively growing. Uh, there's syncretism in the black community, but I could have done another chapter on it. They just wouldn't let us do no more chapters. But yeah, it was like, y'all can't say everything. This book will be 10,000 pages long. But black atheism is on the rise, and part of it, the gateway to black atheism was through Egypt. So Egyptian, or Kemetic, they like to call it, is when you look at Kemetic, the guy deals with Kemetics, Bantu, Dr. Bantu does an amazing job on it. But that they view Egyptian lore as symbolism for science and sociology. And so they believe that the Egyptians were high level, were just utilized figurative language to describe scientific reality, which is really just borrowed from 18th century mystics of the Theosophical Society, everybody from Albert Boyd Kuhn, Helena Blavatsky, Jerome Macy, even though those people were mysticists and Satanists in some ways. And so through that was the gateway to just seeing African ideology as ways that they had in their primitive times of describing science. And so really all of this stuff is scientific, and now but really it's secular atheism, secular humanism, and secular Egyptomania with blackface. There's a great book written on Egyptomania. I forgot the author's name of it. Amazing book,
Huh.
amazing book. That really, yes. And so a lot of the arguments within, which funny, they say we're the white man's religion, but when you look at most of the sources, even if you look at John Henry Clark, Dr. Ben, you look at Chancellor Williams, Warren Williams, all of those who kind of, George C. Jackson, they borrowed from 18th century mystics and put blackface on it and utilized and transported their information into academia. At Cornell, some of them, which was very surprising, that
Hmm.
Cornell even let some of the, what I would say, false scholarship, if you would, pseudo scholarship, make its way in. And I think because of the what do you call it? Oh man, it just went blank. Oh man, I went blank on
That's
it. But it's
okay.
basically when they had to have black people come in and teach. I forgot what it's called when you when you say you have to have a quota of blacks. And so ended up, because they didn't want to be viewed as racist, they let some of these guys get away with pseudo stuff that ended up getting authorized in academic circles. But as you know, and I know, a lot of the Egyptian mystery stuff was debunked, even by secular scholars that saying Christianity did not come from Egypt. And so that's
Right.
revisionist history. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So when you get, I think it's one of the last chapters in the book, and it's on atheism again. There's discussion, and then there's a later chapter on absolute truth, reliability scriptures, the resurrection, the existence of God. These are like classical apologetic issues.
Yeah,
Is there? But I noticed who you footnoted were almost entirely white authors who have developed these kind of ideas.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Is Why do you think that is? Is there not interest in this? Is the interest growing? Um, why are more African American scholars not weighing into these kind of apologetic issues, or are they, and it's just not on my radar?
It's not as much. I think what we've been doing by the grace of God has been bringing a lot of attention to it. I have some scholars at a lot of the conservative schools, and a lot of people are saying we're making this book require reading in our missiology programs, apologetics programs, because really, a lot of classical apologetics has been more cosmological, ontological, and teleological, and so now
Hmm.
we're seeing um, there being contextual apologetic needs that even though some of these end up touching the classical apologetics arena, but down under that is basically a fourth that I don't think people pay much attention to. But because I pastor Gen Z and I pastor millennials, so I mean I can't ignore it. And a lot of times in the academic world, a lot of my Gen Zs, who I have a lot of, probably 75% of my church has a professional degree,
Wow.
partly in an inner city, and
Hmm.
so because we're around colleges, I mean, I'm in the mecca of where all of the Ivy Leagues are. Several of our people went to UPenn. One of my elders went to Princeton, and so you're automatically taught at Temple in different places. Temple is where the word African American was coined in the African American Studies department in the 80s. And so when they go in class, it's almost an assumption that Christianity is a non-logical fit, not just for blacks, but for anybody. And so I think that now there's beginning to be a shift. You got people like the Jude 3
Hmm.
Project that's doing some stuff. You got Damon Richard, well, that's her, Lisa Fields, shout out to them. You have Urban Logia with Damon Richardson. You have Jerome Gay with Urban Perspective. You have a lot of people that are rising up. You got the bodega ladies; they're fighting some stuff. So it's some people that you need to follow, and we're making it aware. In this book, being the first of its kind is a way that we already got people. I mean, I can't even respond to all of this stuff. How many people are like, man, we got to do this, and my next work is going to
Good.
be on this. So it's inspiring, seemingly enough, a whole movement of us making and developing writings that help combat these issues in our community.
This is awesome to hear that this book, and I'd wondered this, if you felt like it was kind of a charge to get people engaged, but
Yeah,
also reminiscent that changes have been taking place and there's more awareness of the need and role for apologetics than ever. So that's awesome to hear. Hey, let me ask you this. I'm really curious. I get invited in sometimes. I'll speak at like a weekend event to Gen Zers, and I'll get
mm-hmm.
maybe 3 or 4 talks. And if I have 3 or 4 talks, I'll almost always give a first talk on truth because we hear, well, that's
Mm-hmm.
your truth, not my
Yeah,
truth.
yeah, yeah,
And as you
yeah,
talk about in the book, objective versus subjective truth, I'll give a talk on truth. And then
yeah.
I'll give a
Mm-hmm.
talk somehow related to Jesus, either the resurrection or the scriptures. And then typically a talk on a moral issue, almost always sexuality, because kids are
Mm-hmm.
just so hammered with those messages. So,
Absolutely.
truth, historical Jesus, and sexuality, probably my 3 go-tos. I might add problem of evil, but that's essentially, if I had 3 or 4 talks, what I would talk to Gen Zers about. If you had 3 or 4 talks in your setting to talk to Gen Zers, what are the big issues that you would address?
Yeah, syncretism. Of course, black identity. the viability of scripture, the historicity of scripture. Those things would be big issues because a lot of times, I'll just give you an example. I was talking to someone, they told me the Bible was changed. I said,
Hmm.
okay, where? I say, where? Because see, they always want to put us on the back pedal. So I'm like, let's see where it's changed. And you and I both know the Old Testament was written in Hebrew predominantly, and in Daniel and a few places, Aramaic, New Testament, Koine Greek. So I asked them, where's the Bible been changed? And they pull out a King James Version. And old thing in college, they say Shakespeare wrote his name, and I forgot which psalm. You count down age
Right.
24. I don't know if you've ever seen that before, but I'm pretty sure you have. And I begin to ask, I say, show me where it's been changed. And they'll show me in an English Bible. I say, well, it's impossible for you to pull out
Hmm.
an English Bible and tell me where the Bible's been changed. And I say, because if you can pull out a text, you have to pull out a textual apparatus. Even with a Hebrew Israelite, that they have guys who don't believe the New Testament is inspiration. They believe it's commentary. So you got different ones that have different beliefs about it. And so one of the things that I said, you can't even begin to talk to me about the New Testament being corrupt fully. We understand what a corruption is, but do you know what an olive transcript is? Do you know what P46 is? Do you know what psi is? I did a little text criticism under Dan Wallace when I was at Dallas Seminary, and so I know enough to be dangerous. But you know, but I said, if you can't, I said, if I put a second century manuscript in front of you and a 10th century manuscript in front of you, based on your knowledge of the languages, are you able to tell me the difference between those two? If you're not, you can't even talk to me about textual criticism. And so
Hmm.
one of the ways that you help people to understand, like, you're making eternal decisions based on second and third hand information. And when you begin letting people know, you really don't know what in the heck you're talking about. And so you just let memes and YouTube channels of people who've read. I mean, as a professor, the amount of information that you have to wade through to make a textual critical decision. It doesn't even make sense. And so when you begin to help people to swim in their lack of knowledge, then they begin to backpedal and realize, man, I don't know what in the world I'm talking about.
So how is it received if you speak in an urban setting at a black church and you lay out, hey, here's the manuscripts we have, here's textual criticism, we have reason to believe this is true? Like, because I get different kinds of pushbacks. Sometimes in my setting,
Yeah.
people say, we just need faith, don't think too hard. Other people get really excited, they'll get supportive. What is there a common kind? Some people are like, why have I never heard this before? What's the reception in the urban setting if you lay out a case for like textual criticism and the scriptures for people today, primarily in the church?
Well, it's fortified a lot of our people. We do that.
Hmm.
We've had an apologetic series during the pandemic where we did on Facebook, and it got thousands of views. And
Wow.
yeah, thousands upon thousands of views. And it's interesting. People end up saying, "Man, I didn't realize this." I didn't realize this. And so I think that what's happened is that because Gen Zers are asking more, they have more information available to them. And so I think Bart Ehrman has done a lot of damage,
Yes, he
and
has.
a lot of damage. What makes him credible is the fact that he studied under Bruce Metzger. And so one of the damaging arguments that he tried to do, I wish if I screen shared, I could show you how the arguments changed as over time. I think I put it in the book, of how the conscious community continues to change their arguments against Christianity. And one of the last ones was, one of the last arguments was, I know about Bauer, his resource that he wrote, that that basically said that Christianity was really a generous orthodoxy in the early church, and there really was multiple Christianities. And of course, Bart Ehrman has grabbed a hold of that, and so now they're trying to use that as an argument against Christianity. And so you got, of course, our brothers writing on the heresy of orthodoxy, which has been a very, very helpful book, and basically talking about the fact that the heresy exists because truth does. If there was nothing to correct, we wouldn't be calling something heresy. That means that orthodoxy existed since Jesus and through the apostles and on through the apologists, the theologians, so forth and so on. So yeah.
Eric, are you encouraged? Are you discouraged by where this conversation is at right now? And I realize this is a larger conversation, but you're
Yeah.
venturing into the world of urban apologetics, which is new in many ways for people like me and for others, probably in the white community and others.
Yeah.
Are you
Yeah.
encouraged by the reception? Are you discouraged? What's your takeaway now that this book's going into its second print and you've been doing this for a while?
Yeah. So to be honest, man, the encouragement has been crazy because I started publicly doing urban apologetics. I've always kind of done urban apologetics, but because of the way the racial climate in the culture has turned a lot of Black people away from Christianity or questioning Christianity, uh, we've seen the arguments that we've put out through videos. I did a woke church series. We did a woke church series where we talked about the Christianity, the white man's religion, and we've done so much on that. And so what's ended up happening is tens of thousands of Black people and even white people and Hispanics, Latinos, my brown siblings, and Africans. They have begun to take in these arguments, and now they're able to defend the faith. We post resources, and it has been a massive. I've had Hebrew Israelites convert and say, "Man, it's because of you guys' work
Wow.
that I'm now a believer." And I couldn't believe that, I believe that the law could justify. And he said, at the center of my theology really wasn't the law, it was me. And, you have people that are converting from the Kemetic community. After we did a debate at my church, a Bantu did against this guy named Jabari Osaze, which is a Kemetic priest. And he has a temple in New York. And a guy came up to me afterwards. Well, he was hollering during the debate, asking questions and being very aggressive, big burly dude, and then after the debate, he was speechless, and he came up to me. He had on he had on a dashiki, and he came up to me and said, "Man, I grew up in the church, man. I've never heard Christians answer questions like this." He said, "I never knew this existed," and they're shocked. And he teared up, and he said, "Can you pray for me?" And I went in praying like an old church mother in the 1930s in a broken down church with buckets to hold rainwater, man. And and man, it was a great opportunity. He didn't necessarily come to faith at that time, but of course we know that First Corinthians chapter 3 verse 6 says, "One plants, one waters, God adds the growth." And so I'll gladly be a part of anybody's journey to faith. And one of the things that we like to do, we invite doubt, we invite skepticism. And inviting that skeptic, churches need to not be scared of skepticism. We have to be equipped to be able to deal with that skepticism and build an environment of grace, an environment of love. Because what does 2 Timothy 2 says? Who knows? Maybe you'll lead the sinner to repentance. And so I think we got to do that, man.
Well, I love hearing that you are encouraged and positive about how this is taking place and the responses. It's awesome. That's fantastic.
Well, on the other hand, I have gotten a lot of because of the whole race conversation, and of course my other book, Woke Church, I get people assuming that I'm promoting ethnocentrism and that I'm promoting, CRT or Marxism. And so when they see urban apologetics restoring Black dignity with the gospel, they're thinking I got a different gospel. So that kind of stuff is out there, but I really ignore it because I know that none of those people are going to turn their face towards the mission field that we have before us.
Well, at some point, maybe you could come back on and we could discuss some of the issues of CRT and cultural Marxism and wokeness and in a little more depth where we have common ground, and maybe you and I see some things differently there. I'd love to have that conversation with you. What I found is when we try to have these conversations and have common ground, labels are thrown, the conversation is shut down, and I think we don't find the common ground that we have in the gospel and understand also where our differences are, and just not even being willing to have these conversations, I think ultimately is not helpful for the gospel and beyond. So thanks for coming on the channel. I really appreciate it. I hope folks will pick up your book, Urban Apologetics. It's long. You got a lot of chapters in there, but it's really well researched, and you cover a lot of the issues that were really eye-opening to me on the Nation of Islam, on the Black Israelite movement. Some of these are foreign to me, but I was asked recently, I was doing an Instagram live with a friend from a predominantly Black church in New York, and he asked me about kind of ancestral spiritualities, and I thought, man, this is not a question I get asked a lot, but this is growing and it's increasing. I need to be equipped to answer these kinds of questions. So
Absolutely.
I hope folks will pick up a copy of it. Before we wrap up, those of you watching this, make sure you hit subscribe. We have some other conversations coming up you're not going to want to miss. I'm bringing on a well-known progressive writer, progressive Christian. We're going to have a conversation about our similarities, about our differences. Friday, bringing on Craig Evans, one of the leading scholars in the world on the Dead Sea Scrolls, to talk about the recent Dead Sea Scrolls discovery, what it means, all the questions. He studied these firsthand, so you will not want to miss that. Hopefully you'll join us Friday and some other conversations behind the scenes with Craig Keener, with Wayne Grudem, and with others. So make sure you hit subscribe. And if you've ever thought about getting a degree in apologetics, we hope you'd think about joining us here at Biola. There's information below. Again, Dr. Eric Mason, thanks for coming on. I hope we can do this again and explore some of the other issues around this that you mentioned earlier, woke church, critical race theory. It'd be fun to have that kind of sensitive conversation, but really clear the air for some folks, I think would be valuable as well. So don't disappear. I want to chat with you briefly afterwards, but for the rest of you, thanks for tuning in and following the conversation.